Mid-20th-century theories. 1.5. What theories influenced human development research in the mid-20th century? In the mid-20th century, the study of human development expanded into a legitimate discipline. A variety of theories emerged, each of which continues to have followers today. In these theories, the European concern with the individual's inner thoughts and feelings contrasts sharply with the North American academic focus on scientific precision and concrete observable behavior. The psychoanalytic perspective. In the 1930s and 1940s, as most people sought help from professionals to deal with emotional difficulties, a new question had to be addressed. How and why do people become the way they are? To treat psychological problems, psychiatrists and social workers turned to an emerging approach to personality development that emphasized each individual's unique life history. According to the psychoanalytic perspective, people move through a series of stages in which they confront conflicts between biological drives and social expectations. How are these conflicts resolved determines the person's ability to learn, to get along with others, and to cope with anxiety. Among the many individuals who contributed to the psychoanalytic perspective, two were especially influential: Sigmund Freud, founder of the psychoanalytic movement, and Erikson. Freud theory. Freud, a Viennese physician, sought a cure for emotionally troubled adults by having them talk freely about painful events of their childhoods. Working with these recollections, he examined his patients' unconscious motivations and constructed his psychosexual theory, which emphasizes that how parents manage their child's sexual and aggressive drives in the first few years is crucial for healthy personality development. In Freud's theory, three parts of the personality, the id, ego, and superego, became integrated during 5 stages summarized in Table 1.2. The id, the largest portion of the mind, is the source of basic biological needs and desires. The ego, the conscious, rational part of personality, emerges in early infancy to redirect the id's impulses so they are discharged in acceptable ways. Between 3 and 6 years of age, the superego or conscience develops as parents insist that children conform to the values of society. Now the ego faces the increasingly complex task of reconciling the demands of the id, the external world, and conscience. For example, the id's impulse to grab an attractive toy from a playmate versus the superego's warning that such behavior is wrong. According to Freud, the relations established among id, ego, and superego during the preschool years determine the individual's basic personality. Freud believed that during childhood, sexual impulses shift their focus from the oral to the anal to the genital regions of the body. In each stage, parents walk a fine line between permitting too much or too little gratification of their child's basic need. If parents strike an appropriate balance, children grow into well-adjusted adults with a capacity for mature sexual behavior and investment in family life. Freud's theory was the first to stress the influence of the early parent-child relationship on development, but his perspective was eventually criticized. First, it overemphasized the influence of sexual feelings in development. Second, because it was based on the problems of sexual repressed, well-to-do adults in 19th century Victorian society, it did not apply in other cultures. Finally, Freud had not studied children directly. Erikson's theory. Several of Freud's followers took what was useful from his theory and improved on his vision. The most important is Erikson, who expanded the picture of development at each stage. In his psychosocial theory, Erikson emphasized that in addition to mediating between id impulses and superego demands, the ego makes a positive contribution to development, acquiring attributes and skills that make the individual an active, contributing member of society. A basic psychosocial conflict, which is resolved along a continuum from positive to negative, determines healthy or maladaptive outcomes at each stage. As Table 1.2 shows, Erikson's first 5 stages parallel Freud's stages, but Erikson added 3 adult stages. Unlike Freud, Erikson pointed out that normal development must be understood in relation to each culture's life situation. For example, in the 1940s, he observed that Yurok Indians of the northwest coast of the United States deprived newborns of breastfeeding for the first 10 days, instead feeding them a thin soup. At age 6 months, infants were abruptly weaned, if necessary, by having the mother leave for a few days. From our cultural vantage point, these practices seem cruel. But Erikson explained that because the Yurok depended on salmon, which filled the river just once a year, the development of self-restraint was essential for survival. In this way, he showed that child-rearing is a response to the competencies valued and needed by an individual society. Contributions and limitations of the psychoanalytic perspective. A special strength of the psychoanalytic perspective is its emphasis on the individual's unique life history as worthy of study and understanding. Consistent with this view, psychoanalytic theorists accept the clinical or case study method, which synthesizes information from a variety of sources into a detailed picture of the personality of a single person. We will discuss this method further at the end of this chapter. Psychoanalytic theory has also inspired a wealth of research on many aspects of emotional and social development, including infant-caregiver attachment, aggression, sibling relationships, child-rearing practices, morality, gender roles, and adolescent identity. Despite its extensive contributions, the psychoanalytic perspective is no longer the mainstream of human development research. Psychoanalytic theories may have become isolated from the rest of the field because they were so strongly committed to in-depth study of individuals that they failed to consider other methods. In addition, many psychoanalytic ideas, such as psychosexual stages and ego functioning, are too vague to be tested empirically. Nevertheless, Erikson's broad outline of lifespan change captures key, optimal psychosocial attainments during each major period of the life course. We will return to it along with other perspectives inspired by Erikson's theory in later chapters. Behaviorism and social learning theory. As the psychoanalytic perspective gained in prominence, the study of development was also influenced by a very different perspective. According to behaviorism, directly observable events, stimuli and responses, are the appropriate focus of study. North American behaviorism began in the early 20th century with the work of John Watson, who wanted to create an objective science of psychology. Traditional behaviorism. Watson was inspired by Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov's study of animal learning. Pavlov knew that dogs release saliva as an innate reflex when they are given food, but he noticed that his dogs were salivating before they tasted any food, when they saw the trainer who usually fed them. The dogs, Pavlov reasoned, must have learned to associate a neural stimulus, the trainer, with another stimulus, food, that produces a reflexive response, salivation. Because of this association, the neutral stimulus alone could bring about a response resembling the reflex. Eager to test this idea, Pavlov successfully taught dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by pairing it with the presentation of food. He had discovered classical conditioning. Watson wanted to find out if classical conditioning could be applied to children's behavior. In a historic experiment, he taught Albert, an 11-month-old infant, to fear a neutral stimulus, a soft white rat, by presenting it several times with a sharp, loud sound which naturally scared the baby. Little Albert, who at first had reached out eagerly to touch the furry rat, began to cry and retreat at the sight of it. In fact, Albert's fear was so intense that researchers eventually challenged the ethics of studies like this one. Watson concluded that environment is the supreme force in development and that adults can mold children's behavior by carefully controlling stimulus-response associations. He viewed development as continuous, a gradual increase with age in the number and strength of these associations. Another form of behaviorism was B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning theory. According to Skinner, the frequency of a behavior can be increased by following it with a wide variety of reinforcers, such as food, praise, or a friendly smile, or decreased through punishment, such as disapproval or withdrawal of privileges. As a result of Skinner's work, operant conditioning became a broadly applied learning principle. We will consider these basic learning capacities further in Chapter 4. Social learning theory. Psychologists wondered whether behaviorism might offer a more direct and effective explanation of the development of social behavior than the less precise concept of psychoanalytic theory. This sparked approaches that built on the principles of conditioning, providing expanded views of how children and adults acquire new responses. Several kinds of social learning theory emerged. The most influential, devised by Albert Bandura, emphasizes modeling, also known as imitation or observational learning, as a powerful source of development. The baby who claps her hands after her mother does so, the child who angrily hits a playmate in the same way that he has been punished at home, and the teenager who wears the same clothes and hairstyle as her friends at school are all displaying observational learning. In his early work, Bandura found that diverse factors affect children's motivation to imitate, their own history of reinforcement or punishment for the behavior, the promise of future reinforcement or punishment, and even observations of the model being reinforced or punished. Bandura's work continues to influence much research on social development, but today his theory stresses the importance of cognition or thinking. In fact, the most recent revision of Bandura's theory places such strong emphasis on how we think about ourselves and other people that he calls it a social cognitive rather than a social learning approach. In Bandura's revised view, children gradually become more selective in what they imitate. From watching others engage in self-praise and self-blame and through feedback about the worth of their own actions, children develop personal standards for behavior and a sense of self-efficacy, the belief that their own abilities and characteristics will help them succeed. These cognitions guide responses in particular situations. For example, imagine a parent who often remarks, "I'm glad I kept working on that task, even though it was hard," and who encourages persistence by saying, "I know you can do a good job on that homework." Soon the child starts to view herself as hardworking and high-achieving and selects people with these characteristics as models. In this way, as individuals acquire attitudes, values, and convictions about themselves, they control their own learning and behavior. Contributions and limitations of behaviorism and social learning theory. Behaviorism and social learning theory have been helpful in treating a wide range of adjustment problems. Applied behavior analysis consists of careful observations of individual behavior and related environmental events, followed by systematic changes in those events based on procedures of conditioning and modeling. The goal is to eliminate undesirable behaviors and increase desirable responses. It has been used to relieve a wide range of difficulties in children and adults, ranging from poor time management and unwanted habits to serious problems such as language delays, persistent aggression, and extreme fears. Nevertheless, many theorists believe that behaviorism and social learning theory offer too narrow a view of important environmental influences, which extend beyond immediate reinforcement, punishment, and modeled behaviors to people's rich physical and social worlds. Behaviorism and social learning theory have also been criticized for underestimating people's contributions to their own development. Bandura, with his emphasis on cognition, is unique among theorists whose work grew out of the behaviorist tradition in granting children and adults an active role in their own learning. Piaget's cognitive developmental theory. If one individual has influenced research on child development more than any other, it is Swiss cognitive theorist Jean Piaget. North American investigators had been aware of Piaget's work since 1930, but they did not grant it much attention until the 1960s, mainly because Piaget's ideas were at odds with behaviorism, which dominated North American psychology in the mid-20th century. Piaget did not believe that children's learning depends on reinforcers, such as rewards from adults. According to his cognitive developmental theory, children actively construct knowledge as they manipulate and explore their world. Piaget's stages. Piaget's view of development was greatly influenced by his early training in biology. Central to his theory is the biological concept of adaptation. Just as structures of the body are adapted to fit with the environment, so structures of the mind develop to better fit with or represent the external world. In infancy and early childhood, Piaget claimed children's understanding is different from adults. For example, he believed that young babies do not realize that an object hidden from view, a favorite toy or even the mother, continues to exist. He also concluded that preschoolers' thinking is full of faulty logic. For example, children younger than age 7 commonly say that the amount of a liquid changes when it's poured into a different shaped container. According to Piaget, children eventually revise these incorrect ideas in their ongoing efforts to achieve an equilibrium or balance between internal structures and information they encounter in their everyday worlds. In Piaget's theory, as the brain develops and children's experiences expand, they move through 4 broad stages, each characterized by qualitatively distinct ways of thinking. Table 1.3 provides a brief description of Piaget's stages. Cognitive development begins in the sensory-motor stage, with the baby's use of the senses and movements to explore the world. These action patterns evolve into the symbolic but illogical thinking of the preschooler in the pre-operational stage. Then cognition is transformed into the more organized, logical reasoning of the school-aged child in a concrete operational stage. Finally, in the formal operational stage, thought becomes the abstract, systematic reasoning system of the adolescent and adult. Piaget devised special methods for investigating how children think. Early in his career, he carefully observed his 3 infant children and presented them with everyday problems, such as an attractive object that could be grasped, mouthed, kicked, or searched for. From their responses, Piaget derived his ideas about cognitive changes during the first 2 years. To study childhood and adolescent thought, Piaget adapted a clinical method of psychoanalysis, conducting open-ended clinical interviews in which a child's initial response to a task served as the basis for Piaget's next question. We will look more closely at this technique when we discuss research methods later in this chapter. Contributions and limitations of Piaget's theory. Piaget convinced the field that children are active learners whose mind consists of rich structures of knowledge. Besides investigating children's understanding of the physical world, Piaget explored their reasoning about their social world. His stages have sparked a wealth of research on children's conceptions of themselves, other people, and human relationships. In practical terms, Piaget's theory encouraged the development of educational philosophies and programs that emphasize discovery, learning, and direct contact with the environment. Despite Piaget's overwhelming contributions, his theory has been challenged. Research indicates that Piaget underestimated the competencies of infants and preschoolers. When young children are given tasks scaled down in difficulty and relevant to their everyday experiences, their understanding appears closer to that of the older child and adult than Piaget assumed. Also, adolescents generally teach their full intellectual potential only in areas of endeavor in which they have had extensive education and experience. These findings have led many researchers to conclude that cognitive maturity depends heavily on the complexity of knowledge sampled and the individual's familiarity with the task. Furthermore, children's performance on Piagetian problems can be improved with training, findings that call into question Piaget's assumption that discovery learning rather than adult teaching is the best way to foster development. Critics also point out that Piaget's stage-wise account pays insufficient attention to social and cultural influences on development. Finally, lifespan theorists, challenging Piaget's conclusion that no new stages occur after adolescence, have proposed important transformations in adulthood. Today, the field of developmental science is divided over its loyalty to Piaget's ideas. Those who continue to find merit in Piaget's stages often accept a modified view, one in which changes in thinking take place more gradually than Piaget believed. Among those who disagree with Piaget's stage sequence, some have embraced an approach that emphasizes continuous gains in children's cognition, information processing, and still others have been drawn to theories that focus on the role of children's social and cultural context. We take up these approaches in the next session. But first, ask yourself. Connect. Although social learning theory focuses on social development and Piaget's theory on cognitive development, each has enhanced our understanding of other domains. Mention an additional domain addressed by each theory. Apply. A 4-year-old becomes frightened of the dark and refuses to go to sleep at night. How would a psychoanalyst and a behaviorist differ in their views of how this problem developed? Reflect. Illustrate Bandura's ideas by describing a personal experience in which you observed and received feedback from another person that strengthened your sense of self-efficacy. Belief that your abilities and characteristics will help you succeed. Table 1.2. Freud's psychosexual stages and Erikson's psychosocial stages compared. Birth up to 1 year old. According to Freud. Oral. If oral needs are not met through sucking from breast or bottle, the individual may develop such habits as thumb sucking, fingernail biting, overeating, or smoking. As compared to Erikson's stage, basic trust versus mistrust. From warm, responsive care, infants gain a sense of trust or confidence that the world is good. Mistrust occurs if infants are neglected or handled harshly. 1 to 2 years. Freud's stage, anal. Toddlers and preschoolers enjoy holding and releasing urine and feces. If parents toilet train before children are ready to or make too few demands, conflicts about anal control may appear in the form of extreme orderliness or disorder. Erikson proposes autonomy versus shame and doubt. Using new mental and motor skills, children want to decide for themselves. Parents can foster the autonomy by permitting reasonable free choice and not forcing or shaming the child. 3 to 6 years. Freud's stage. Phallic. As preschoolers take pleasure in genital stimulation, Freud's Oedipus conflict for boys and Electra conflict for girls arise. Children feel a sexual desire for the other sex parent. To avoid punishment, they gave up this desire and adopt the same sex parent's characteristics and values. As a result, the superego is formed and children feel guilty when they violate its standards. Erikson proposed initiative versus guilt. Through make-believe play, children gain insight into the person they can become. Initiative, a sense of ambition and responsibility, develops when parents support their child's sense of purpose. If parents demand too much self-control, children experience excessive guilt. 6 to 11 years. Freud's stage, latency. Sexual instincts die down and the superego strengthens as children acquire new social values from adults and same-sex peers. Erikson proposes industry versus inferiority. At school, children learn to work and cooperate with others. Inferiority develops when negative experiences at home, at school, or with peers lead to feelings of incompetence. Adolescence. Freud's stage. Genital. With puberty, sexual impulses reappear. Successful development during earlier stages lead to marriage, mature sexuality, and child-rearing. Erikson proposes identity versus role confusion. By exploring values and vocational goals, young people form a personality identity. The negative outcome is confusion about future adult roles. And while Freud didn't have any stages for early adulthood, middle adulthood, and old age, Erikson proposes early adulthood. Intimacy versus isolation. Young adults establish intimate relationships. Because of earlier disappointments, some individuals cannot form close bonds and remain isolated. Middle adulthood. Generativity versus stagnation. Generativity means giving to the next generation through child rearing, caring for others, or productive work. The person who fails in these ways feels an absence of meaningful accomplishments. Old age. Integrity versus despair. Integrity results from feeling that life was worth living as it happened. Older people who are dissatisfied with their lives fear death. Table 1.3. Piaget's stages of cognitive development. The sensory motor stage, from birth up to 2 years. Infants think by acting on the world with their eyes, ears, hands, and mouth. As a result, they invent ways of solving sensory motor problems, such as pulling a lever to hear the sound of a music box, finding hidden toys, and putting objects into and taking them out of containers. Pre-operational stage, 2 to 7 years. Preschool children use symbols to represent their earlier sensory-motor discoveries. Development of language and make-believe play takes place. However, thinking lacks the logic of the two remaining stages. Concrete operational stage, 7 to 11 years. Children's reasoning becomes logical and better organized. School-aged children understand that a certain amount of lemonade or Play-Doh remains the same even after its appearance changes. They also organize objects into hierarchies of classes and subclasses. However, children think in a logical, organized fashion only when dealing with concrete information they can perceive directly. Formal operational, 11 years onwards. The capacity for abstract, systematic thinking enables adolescents, when faced with a problem, to start with a hypothesis, deduce testable inferences, and isolate and combine variables to see which inferences are confirmed. Adolescents can also evaluate the logic of verbal statements without referring to real-world circumstances.